the So after the opening sessions and after I go through some of these remarks, I will be inviting the to come to the stage to give us some insights. And let's begin with this. You have the agenda in front of you. And can I ask who have signed up to swap card? Have anyone signed up to swap card? Oh, that's excellent. Almost everyone has signed up to swap card. There's a wonderful person in the room was looking like, what is swap card? I will come down and help you with the information. Once you sign up to swap card, it's an app that would allow you to access to all of these information, including the contact detail of all of the participants to this conference, speakers, their bios, and their research materials. So please sign up to that, and you can also let the teams know on Swapcard which breakout session you will be going to. Without further ado, please, could you increase the volume a bit, please? Without further ado, I would like to invite Sang Or Chung. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I've been practicing this too. Sang Or Chung will, before we go further, Sang would give us some inspirational work to set also the stage for this morning. Sang, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Siang Orchung from Myanmar, and I belong to the Chin's Indigenous people from Myanmar. And thank you very much for giving me these opportunities. Actually, it will not be the inspirational word or speech, just some word of our experience. Just recently, I went back to my community after 4 years after our country political situations. And it took me 5 days to reach my community. Before these political situations, it's only 2 days of travel, but it took me 5 days. And when I found that my community has changed a lot, and the household population has increased in double because of the conflict in the region. The population has increased in double by the IDP, and the community they started to use the chemical fertilizer, herbicide, pesticides for some point to enormously. The fact that my community is well known for its soil fertilities and its rich in biodiversity. During my stay for 2 months in my community after 4 years, I hardly hear the songs of birds singing, and also the news of game meat, because we are the Chin people, we are a hunter. Hunting is our one of our livelihood, but after 2 months, I hardly hear the songs of the news of game meat. And that kind of made me realize that the impact of the conflict, the armed conflict. And yeah, so today we are here. So I'm really give thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunities, and by utilizing the given opportunities, I would like to say that we are really much grateful to be here, actually. For the people in these events, there's a lot of member participants, and each of us face different and unique challenges even to be here. But we are here because that we feel we are strengthened. We feel stronger when we are here together, gather together, share our difficult struggle, experience, and things. And I would like to say it, and I really hope that for the next 3 days, we will be talking what we have achieved so far and what we will do next, the future opportunities for the future initiative. And I really hope that what we will be discussing here to be not only just for discussion only, but also for actionable discussion to respond and redress conflicts within country, conflicts within peoples, conflict with natures and biodiversity. Only with and foster peace. Only with peace, everything will be fostered. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sang, for your inspiring word. Before we move to track A conversation, we have an interesting panel you will enjoy. Let me go through a few important housekeeping. When we go into the breakout, there'll be coffee session and there'll be breakout later. Please try to go to those sessions of your choosing a few minutes before so we all can be seated and start on time. And we try to split people across all the room fairly. So if you arrive in each of the breakout room and it's full, please go to the next one and then or come back in the other sessions. There are 250 of us. So please try to go to where you're interested in a few minutes prior. And the principle of how we will work together, I mentioned that quite a bit already about how we practice active listening to each other, and that mature respect is the fundamental practice we have here today. And try to speak slowly, because there are friends who are not speaking English as their first language. And do offer space to people and listen to differing opinions from those that are not necessarily coming from or sharing your perspective. Now, something important about lunch. If you stay with us till lunch, when you go out of this room, at the lunch break, there will be colleagues. Look out for them at the exit and collect lunch coupon. Lunch will be on the first floor at the public restaurant. And for those of you, actually everyone, not just the guests who stay in this hotel, all MLLG participants, wherever you stay, whether you're just visiting for the day, the hotel is giving special discount for dinner. 30% discount on food and beverage for all the public restaurant on the first floor, and 20% discount for the Benihana restaurant, the Japanese one, on the second floor. Okay, so consider bringing a friend from outside, from Bangkok. It will be a great opportunity to miss. And if you have any question, if anything, when in doubt, look for the colleague, MLG. She's modeling there with that color. That's the MLG colleague. Grab them, ask them any question, they'll be able to direct and assist you. And when you go out to breakout rooms, there will be colleagues who will also try to direct the traffic. Now, we will be moving on to these really interesting conversations on how we're going about securing land rights as a climate solutions. We have two important speakers who are joining us here in person. Michael Dwyer, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly as well. He will be joining us. He is Associate Professor of Geography at Indiana University. His research examined the intersections of agrarian changes, environmental governance, and energy and infrastructures development with a regional focus on mainland Southeast Asia. Michael, would you like to come to maybe take that stage there, or if you prefer standing, you can take this mic too, and you have 20 minutes, sir.
Is it okay if I move these things? Is this your phone? Yes, it's my phone. Can I give it to you? Good morning, everybody. There we go. Friends, can you hear me? Do I need to get down like this? You can hear. Friends, excellencies, colleagues, it's really an honor to be back with you. This is, I think, my third Mekong Region Land Forum, and it's really amazing to see how far this project and this collectivity of people have come. It's my job this morning to talk about what I'll be describing as the climate tenure nexus. And this is a difficult talk for me to give because a lot of the material that I'm forced to talk about is very abstract. And I really appreciate Mr. Sieng's grounding us in some very specifics of places, peoples, landscapes in the region. And so I'm going to try to balance that as much as I can. But I also apologize for the abstraction as well. And I hope that it can feed our discussions in the days to come. So I want to begin here. A few weeks ago, Tropical Storm Kajiki brought heavy rain, flooding, and landslides to the northern Mekong region. A Category 2 typhoon when it first hit the coast over northern Vietnam and southern China, the storm weakened as it headed inland. But as it did so, it inundated tens of thousands of buildings, hundreds of thousands of hectares of farmland, and triggered landslides like this one, which killed 5 and left 7 people missing in Ban Bang Ung, a mountainous village in western Chiang Mai province. Climate science tells us that these events are already getting stronger and more frequent, and that this will intensify in the coming decades as the global hydrologic cycle speeds up as it gathers more energy, right? Heat is energy, it's motion. What this looks like locally and regionally, however, is very much up in the air, and the reasons for this uncertainty are instructive. So first, very little of this uncertainty is about the climate itself. There is some question about what's going to happen to the monsoon in the region. It's a complex system after all, and it already varies significantly from year to year, but we do know that extreme precipitation events will increase in their duration and their frequency and their magnitude. The real question of uncertainty has to do with what we do, both globally and locally. As I know you know, the magnitude of global carbon emissions remains a moving target. The NDC process, begun in Paris in 2015, is an effort to stabilize emissions sooner rather than later but this is far from perfect. And as an American, I know that you know this is an extreme understatement. And more locally, events like this landslide exemplify the crucial fact that climate change is never experienced in isolation. Its impacts always depend on the local context of the climate event. Who is actually in harm's way and under what conditions? In this case, it wasn't even primarily the volume, it wasn't just or even primarily the volume of rain that fell inside this area. It was outside it was an extreme precipitation event. But this area was also prone to landslides in a few ways. Wrong way. First, it's in the uplands. And despite being a mostly forested area, this means that the local land base around the village has what the FAO calls severe limitations in terms of its soil and terrain, steep slopes, in other words. And even more locally, you zoom in here, to the scale at which the things that produce landslides actually interact, things like weather, soil, terrain, and crucially, land cover, you see that this area is actually at the low end of what land system scientists call forest landscape integrity, due to various anthropogenic disturbances like road building, agriculture, and forestry. Landslides, in short, are both disastrous, but in this area, they're not unpredicted. And this brings us to a challenge. Social scientists have warned us about the normalization of disaster as climate change intensifies. Thinking for a minute with the case of Ban Pang-eung, you can see how this could be a real possibility if extreme rain events get worse and the local conditions of exposure, the infrastructure, the forest integrity, the presence of people living in this land doesn't also change as well. So the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, conceptualizes climate risk in a language that echoes this point. We know that as climate change intensifies in the Mekong region, mean temperature, extreme heat, heavy precipitation, coastal flooding, and coastal erosion, things that we're already seeing, are set to increase with very high uncertainty. We also know that these are the hazards. We also know that historical conditions across the region, a huge category that includes everything from recent policy decisions all the way back to colonial era exploitation and extractive underdevelopment, and everything in between, have created patterns of vulnerability and climate exposure that vary significantly from place to place, but that in aggregate have created a mix of high vulnerability and exposure, both nationally and for the region as a whole. This slide shows a vulnerability index that's used by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank in their country climate risk profiles. And while you can see that the variability in enclosure corresponds closely with regular development metrics in terms of country positions, there's serious vulnerability in the region, and there has been worryingly little improvement over 30 years. So this leaves a lot for us in this final piece of the risk equation, response. And it's here that I want to talk about secure tenure as a climate solution. We should not be accepting the normalization of a disaster. And here tenure provides both an opportunity and, as I'll argue, an imperative. I'll say more about the nexus of climate and tenure later after I've talked a little bit more about climate, but I want to make 4 opening propositions so you know where we're going. First, vulnerability and adaptation are multi-scalar, right? I'm a geographer. I like to talk about scale. I hope you all do too. And tenure is a key institution through which these are mediated at multiple scales. So even if vulnerability and adaptation are often measured and quantified nationally, as I just showed you, these are aggregate measures of things that vary a lot by location and that reflect a mix of social and natural factors that come together at what's often called the landscape scale, right? My example from Ban Pang-eung. Land tenure, the rules that determine legitimate land and resource access, is a key institution through which various determinants of vulnerability and adaptation intersect, and it is also multi-scalar. The durability of land and resource access depends on rules that are made and enforced at multiple scales. National law, certainly, but also more localized things like land zoning, concessions, or land titling schemes, right? And note, I'm echoing a comment that's been made before, tenure is not the same as property, right? Tenure relations in any one place thus reflect the histories of land use, development policy, conservation, infrastructure building, and so on that have intersected in that place at various points in time. This multi-scalar approach to thinking about land tenure is essential when it comes to thinking about climate change. Second proposition. There are a lot of lessons out there, both positive and negative, and both from the region here as well as far away. So first, to stick with our example from Ban Pang Ung, this area reflects a wider history in the region where the uplands have long been imagined as deficient for agriculture, rather than, say, particularly well suited to managing a nexus of upland agriculture and forest land. And I don't have to tell you all, but such negative framings have often gone hand in hand with a shortage of formal tenure options for upland communities. State recognition for community scale land management in the region is rare, and when it does occur, it often appears in forested areas that are outside the traditional uplands, at least as they've been defined here, although there's some variability in what we mean by the uplands, okay? On the other hand, if we zoom out, both within the region to include the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, as well as globally, we see that this shortage of formal recognition is not inevitable. Community land recognition, while still scarce, is increasingly common, and the benefits are increasingly widely acknowledged. In Latin America, for instance, indigenous peoples' territories have significantly lower, so 2 or 3 times lower deforestation rates than surrounding areas. There are also significant correlations between community land control and biodiversity, although the numbers here are understandably subject to debate. Third, but focusing on the climate, I want to make the case this morning that if we take seriously the climate science around forests, there is an especially powerful argument for strengthening community tenure in forested and forest-adjacent landscapes, one that goes beyond improving the lives of the people and ecosystems who live there. It has to do with the regional connectivity between land use and climate, and taking it seriously means acting to recognize and, more importantly, sustain and rebuild the climate services that these communities provide to national populations and economies. This means elevating community tenure security to a policy issue at the highest levels and supporting it with appropriate pillars of state policy. This has significant implications for reversing the marginal status that upland and forest communities have traditionally occupied vis-a-vis historical and modern states in the region. And I'm going to argue that it provides an imperative for rethinking the region itself. While many of the implications of this position are national and subnational within the countries of the Mekong region, there are also important implications for the international funding community, and I know we'll talk more about these later this morning. So first, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking through projected climate change impacts for the region, and then I'm going to return to this nexus of climate and tenure and what we can do about it. Okay. So first, climate change impacts and the centrality of forests. So in the world of climate policy, it's increasingly common to talk about climate futures. This refers to the fact that the future is not predictable, but it's actually something that we are deciding on day by day, month by month, year by year with our decisions about what to do policy-wise, as well as the unexpected hiccups that we get with things that we don't plan for. Right? This is an infographic from the IPCC's latest assessment, and what it's showing is that our space to act is constraining the longer we wait. Acting early gives us more options. This is a qualitative way to talk about adaptation and resilience. You see, there are no numbers on the y-axis. More commonly, what you'll see is stuff like this. These are emission scenarios, right? And the key thing to look at here on the y-axis are the degrees of global average warming that we're wrestling with when we think through scenarios. So I'm not going to go into lots of different scenarios, but you do need to know some terms, SSP and RCP, in order to understand a little bit of the science that I'm going to show in a minute. So since 2010, IPC scientists have modeled what they call RCPs, or representative concentrations pathways, to capture the range of expected greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades. To standardize the collective work by thousands of scientists, the IPCC put labels on these like 1.9, 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5. These generally, the smaller numbers mean smaller emissions or more active emissions abatements approaches. Whereas the larger ones, the 8.5, are often called business as usual, and they lead to higher aggregate warming. Since 2018, the IPCC has added a second set of scenarios that they call SSPs, or shared socioeconomic pathways. These are the scenarios that deal with basically everything that is not a direct emissions factor, but that's still important for shaping resource needs, among other things, land use. And this means asking questions and making assumptions about population numbers, for example, how many people are consuming, choices about technology and lifestyle, about food and transportation, and crucially about equity, right? Who gets to consume at average levels, and where are those averages, because based on how distribution changes. These have come about amidst rising concern about the inequality in terms of access to climate emission space. And so it's made the scenario process more complicated, but it's actually a good thing, because it means that people are talking seriously about equity and land in ways that are baked into these global numbers that you see even if you don't realize it. I was told that I had 25 minutes. Is that okay? So here's where we need to shift gears and talk about regional climate stuff, right? So the IPCC has said these are the main things that Southeast Asia has to worry about: increased heating, extreme precipitation, and coastal flooding kinds of events, right? And it's one of the regions globally where warming is already most detectable. We've seen record heat waves, national heat records that were set in 2023, in April and May. This was for Bangkok. This was for Laos and Vietnam. And these are the really sort of dangerous, don't go outside kinds of heat warnings. I want to show you two pieces of the climate science that are especially worrying, because as somebody who, as I gestured to before, comes from a country that is not taking this stuff seriously, I don't have many reassurances that we're not on the trajectory to somewhere near 8.5 or close to it. And so this has some pretty scary implications in terms of the ways in which what scientists call the human climate niche is changing. Okay? And what this shows is a study from 2020 that projects the expansion of areas that are basically like parts of the Sahara and the Gulf of Aden now have a mean annual temperature of 29 degrees C. Under 8.5 in 2070, these would expand to all the areas in the hatches. And under SSP3, that would be 2.5 billion people. Mekong region, you can sort of read lowlands and uplands into this, but this is affecting lowland and urban areas especially strongly, right? You see a similar map if you consider not average warming, but days of extreme heat. And this is not the high-end trajectory. This is a probabilistic modeling scenario that comes from the IPCC's latest integrated modeling efforts to try to predict days of extreme heat. Similar kinds of patterns, and what this means by extreme heat is days in which it's basically too dangerous to work outside for hours at a time. So when we think about rice exports, national economies, things to seriously be worried about here, right? So there's some good news here, and this is where we badly need it. And this is where we get the importance of forests in shaping regional climate. I need to read this, sorry. I thought I was going to be able to see the screen. Okay, this is from the IPCC's special report on land from 2019. And it tells us that forests actually have a pretty significant effect on regional climate, and where forest cover increases in tropical regions especially, cooling results from enhanced evapotranspiration, and it can result in cooler days during the growing season and reduce the amplitude of heat-related events. There's been some pretty interesting research started in the Amazon, but that has recently been applied to this region as well. I'm only showing you the results from Southeast Asia, but you can see heating in hotspots that you're probably aware of for deforestation, as well as some pretty interesting blue spots where cooling has happened. And the thing to notice here is the magnitude, right? The temperature scales, they're not as big as the 0 to 5 degrees, but they're also in the same range, 1 to 2 to up to 3 degrees of average warming. This is significant in terms of the way that it impacts potentially the way that global climate change is experienced in the region. And this leads to the essential point of my talk, which is that we have to be thinking about forests as their contributions to national climates and national economies because of this connectivity across hundreds of kilometers. So this wasn't in one of the papers, but it was a really nice anecdote from one of the authors of this new stuff. The average tree is the equivalent of 2 to 3 2.5 kilowatt air conditioners. These are big air conditioners. This is not a little window unit, right? Forests really matter in terms of their abilities to dissipate heat and to shape climate in the region. And they're especially important in the context of things that we can actually control here, as opposed to having to depend on the major global emitters outside the region. Right. So this leads me, I want to make three basic, you could say, three sets of points related to how I think we should be thinking about this climate tenure nexus. First, the idea of the nexus itself is everywhere these days. The land-water nexus, the food-energy nexus. A nexus is just a label to tell us that we don't know how something works. It's complicated, it varies from place to place. It's something that we need to actually study, right? But it's important, right? So this is where we're going. So the title of my talk comes from a riff on a book that's called, what's it called? Nomad Century, that is predicting massive climate relocation and calls on the need for governments and peoples to rethink the nation. It's pretty terrifying, and this book is actually based on the science that I showed before. I'm not going there. I do think that it requires that we rethink the region, and in particular, that it provides an opportunity to upend the historical marginality of forested and forest-dependent communities in relation to urban and lowland spaces in the region. And I think it's an imperative, but it's also an opportunity. So this brings us back to the formalization question, right? There's a lot of research and a lot of activity that has focused on formalization of community tenure in the last 3 decades in this region. Many of you have been part of this. One second here. So I showed this map earlier to illustrate the unevenness of community tenure, but the main story that I want to talk about now is, the areas that have not been recognized, and there are a lot of them on here. It's kind of hard to read this map until you start looking at the details, but much of what is shown here is areas that have not been recognized, but that are either indicative in gray or that are not acknowledged by governments, either for indigenous land or community land. These are the areas that badly need our support. So for the literature on formalization, I've got details here, but I'm running short on time and I'm not going to go through them. there is strong support for formalization of community tenure in particular. It's a lot more mixed when you start talking about individual titling, and especially you see strong support. This is the community tenure stuff. You see it concentrated at the bottom of the literature review here. And it especially works in combination with other kinds of factors that are policies like protected areas, law enforcement, payment for environmental services or PES, commodity certification, and community forestry that are often deployed in combination with recognition of community lands. So these are essential pieces that we need to, oh no, I'm going backwards. Okay. So I'm going to skip that slide. Here we go. So the second point I want to make is that we need to be thinking about these policies as resources that can actually be used along with formalization, and possibly even in places where formalization can't occur or isn't occurring yet, to support communities that are active, that are or have recently managed forest and forest adjacent landscapes. And these are areas that need our support in the form of resources in addition to simply recognition. Okay. What this means is not deploying things like protected areas and forest law enforcement against communities, but actually deploying them in their defense and alongside the kinds of things that they are trying to do already, and really to make these resources. And then also, taking seriously the climate science means that we need to be financing these at the highest possible levels that are adequate to the task at hand, which is not just protecting those communities, but actually protecting national economies. Okay. And then lastly, communities need support, they need resources, but they also need allies. And communities are not going to be able to deal with this themselves. They need the state, they need regulators. We've seen this in the context of the global land rush. And for 10 years, I have been part of the research community that has tried to take tenure formalization seriously without also seeing it as a fix for things like a land rush that are often stronger than the legal rights that may exist for communities. So the agenda here that I'm pointing to has to do with increasing research to essentially put those indicative areas on the map in Southeast Asia where they're currently missing, as well as pairing recognition, resources, and allies with the efforts that we're already doing. So thanks. I apologize. I'm a little bit over time, and I hope we can discuss this a lot more in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Next, we will be listening to Mr. Kevin Currey. Could we bring Mr. Currey up online, please? Mr. Currey is the founder of Wild Field Strategy, a boutique consulting firm advising organizations working on land tenure, forest protections, and climate mitigation. He is the former chair of the Forest Tenure Funders Group, which brings together the government and philanthropic signatories of the $1.7 billion pledge for tenure rights and forest guardianships that was announced at the COP26 in Glasgow. He will be speaking to us about trends in funding for recognitions of tenure rights, momentum of new pledges around COP30 later this year in Brazil, and the need to scale up direct funding for IP&LC and civil society organization. Excellent, you with us. You have 15 minutes, sir.
I'm with you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm also sorry that you have to look at my absolutely enormous head hovering over all of you because I have no slides. Nevertheless, it's a wonderful opportunity to be part of this conversation, and very grateful for the chance to be with all of you. Also want to say thank you very much to Mike. That was an absolutely incredible talk, and I learned a lot. I think Mike hammered home very clearly the idea that securing land and forest tenure for Indigenous peoples and local communities is absolutely essential for mitigating climate change and for protecting biodiversity. And that when tenure is strong, forests remain standing, species are protected, and communities are more resilient. We can debate around the edges, the differences between different countries, different legal regimes, different types of tenure security, but looking across the world, those central facts remain very clearly true. And every year there's more and more research showing that. One interesting dimension that's been popping up more recently in the literature is actually on the health impacts of tenure security, which I think are also very interesting. There's been research in the Brazilian Amazon, for example, showing that by preventing forest fires, indigenous territories are actually able to help avoid 15 million instances of cardiac and respiratory diseases from occurring every year, which saves $2 billion in healthcare costs. There's a more recent paper looking across all of the countries in the Amazon basin, showing that there's also an important role of intact community territories in preventing the emergence of infectious diseases. So the evidence is really piling up. I think in a lot of regions, and including in your region, we are seeing good progress in recognizing rights. Of course, it's too slow. Of course, there are many gaps, and of course, the threats are intensifying. But there's a lot of great work being done on the ground. What I want to talk about is something that's lagging behind all of that, and that's funding. Funding for communities on the ground who are protecting and defending their territories. If we go back to 2021, the international NGO Rainforest Foundation Norway did a study that looked at the past 10 years of funding for tenure rights and forest management for communities in the Global South. What that found is that on average in that period, only $270 million a year was being invested globally on that topic. And that's less than 1%, far less than 1% of climate finance that's available. Far too low, especially if you consider that as much as half of the world's land is managed by those communities. That prompted a group of donors to come together and announce the Glasgow COP in 2021 a new pledge of $1.7 billion that would support tenure rights and forest guardianship of Indigenous peoples and local communities over a 5-year period. That pledge was joined by 5 governments, including the UK, Germany, and Norway, and by a large group of private foundations. And it has led to a fairly significant increase in funding for this topic. The group of signatories has been reporting on their progress every year. They'll be releasing the progress report for year 4 of the pledge next week, and I expect that that report will show that they've actually managed to get that $1.7 billion out a year earlier than expected. So that's very good news. But there's also some bad news. The bad news comes in several forms. Number one, we all see what's happening in the world of overseas development assistance funding in general, especially in the past year or so. So there's significant headwinds that we're facing. We also see that while funding still remains much higher than the previous period in general, we are starting to see declines in overall funding since the peak in 2021, which is also very worrying. There's also the fact that it's proven very difficult for donors to get funding to communities and community organizations on the ground. In other words, to the people who are actually doing the work of protecting the forests and delivering these climate and biodiversity and public health benefits that we've been talking about. And I wanted to look a little bit at some of the reasons for that. There's an interesting study which was put together by the Indigenous Peoples of Asia Solidarity Fund called IPAS, and I'll come back to them in a minute. But interesting study that they released earlier this year, which was a survey of more than 430 Indigenous organizations across Asia. And they looked at funding going to those organizations, how those organizations are being managed, what their priorities are, and what kinds of results they're able to deliver. And a couple of things jump out from that. First of all, they found that more than half of the organizations have annual budgets of 5,000 US dollars or less. So we're talking about organizations that are subsisting with very, very low levels of funding, some of them even with no budget whatsoever. 45% of those organizations have no paid staff. And in organizations that do have paid staff, volunteers outnumber paid staff 11 to 1. You also see that 30% of those organizations have no bank account. About the same percentage are not legally registered, and about the same percentage, 30%, also face restrictions on getting money from abroad. Nevertheless, this is an ecosystem of organizations that's delivering really impressive and important results. But they're small organizations, they're difficult to reach and difficult for donors to find. One of the interesting trends that I think is happening not only in this region, but in other tropical forest countries, is that Indigenous and local community organizations are creating a solution to that problem by building their own locally controlled funds, which are able to receive larger amounts of money from both bilateral donors and from philanthropies, and to break that money up into smaller pieces to reach grassroots organizations and the people doing the work of protecting forests. The Indigenous Peoples of Asia Solidarity Fund, IPAS, is one example of that, which has now developed a network in 12 countries across Asia. They have advisory groups who are able to help find communities that are delivering climate solutions and get money out to them. These funds also exist in Africa and in the Amazon basin. They exist in Indonesia, and they offer a really promising model for getting money out to communities. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is donors are still not taking advantage of this opportunity. Looking again at the donors who are part of the $1.7 billion pledge that I mentioned from COP26, what we see is that far less than 10% of their funding is going out to Indigenous and local community organizations of any kind. That's one important gap that I think remains in this space. So what can we do about that? A couple of opportunities. So I mentioned that this pledge will end at the end of 2025. There are active discussions underway to extend the pledge for another 5 years, hopefully with a larger commitment. There's an active process underway to recruit additional government signatories and additional philanthropic donors to join that pledge. And any governments or philanthropies interested in that, please get in touch with me. There's also a discussion about expanding the scope of that pledge to cover not only tropical forest regions, but also other ecosystems which are important for climate and biodiversity, which Indigenous peoples and local communities are also managing, including coastal regions. So I think that's quite an important development. The Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, which is a group of countries who have come together after the Glasgow Forest Commitment to halt and reverse tropical deforestation by 2030. They're also preparing a land tenure commitment, which will be launched at COP30. That's a commitment by a group of tropical forest countries who are committing to speed up the process of recognizing Indigenous and local community land and to set a quantitative target for how much progress they hope to make by 2030. So there's a great opportunity there for countries to step up, for national governments to step up. We are seeing a number of good examples of countries integrating commitments related to support for Indigenous and local community forest management into their nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC. So formalizing policies that help maximize the climate benefits of Indigenous and local community land management, that's also important. And new global financial mechanisms on the horizon, like the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which also create a pathway for getting additional funding out to countries. And then, of course, to communities doing the real work. So to summarize, I think it's very clear that this is a critical issue that needs much more support. There has been really important progress in the last couple of years, not only in getting the legal frameworks right, but also in terms of slowly increasing levels of funding. But overall levels of funding remain far too small compared to the scope of the opportunity here in terms of what recognizing tenure, securing tenure can mean for the global climate and biodiversity crises. We are seeing funders that are too resistant to finding creative ways of funding on the front lines, funding grassroots organizations. Although there are a number of important developments that communities have put together to make that easier for funders, we see funders are still not taking up their side of the bargain. Nevertheless, at COP30, there are some really important opportunities, both in terms of policy and in terms of funding, for signaling that this will continue to be a priority for the next 5 years or more. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Currey. We have 7 minutes left. We will try to give the space for you to ask any question to both Mr. Dwyer and Currey. Could you bring the Slido up, please? And we will use the Slido to administer the question and answer. Please scan this and type your question. It's up to you if you want to remain anonymous or you say, I asked this person this question and this is me. Or just state the question. Oh, yes, please. It's not working? Could you try to scan that again? Is it working for anyone? Okay, we're fixing it now. While waiting, would anyone like to just get up and how would we do that? Is there a mic? There's a gentleman over there. Please come to the middle line and our colleague is bringing you the mic now.
Thanks. I'm Markus Kukkonen from the World Bank. And while we're waiting, just want to make one comment. So Michael was referring to our research on and a good practice note on strengthening forest area land tenure in Southeast Asia. And in this good practice note, we also we did a meta-analysis of all the counterfactual studies measuring the impact of land tenure interventions on forest cover, which he was referring to, where the evidence is clear that enhancing communal tenure reduces deforestation. But my humble plea to everyone here is that there's a clear research gap and knowledge gap from the Mekong region. So all the studies that we were looking into were all from Latin America, some studies from Indonesia, but there's absolutely no studies from the Mekong region. So we don't really know what is the impact of land tenure interventions on forest cover in this region. So my plea, if there's any researchers, if any research-oriented projects, donors, please consider including this kind of research to your work in the upcoming future. Thank you. And by the way, if anybody's interested in the study, I have the postcards with the QR code.
Thank you for sharing. And Michael, would you like to touch on this very quickly? Just 1 minute, please.
Sure.
And before Michael responds, the slide is working. Could you bring that up again? And I'll ask you to just refresh it and then enter the question while you're listening to Michael responding to this. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Marcus, A, for being part of the team that put together that study, and B, for your comments and call for the research base. One of the things that I noticed in both reading Marcus's study as well as the also very large and review of what works in controlling deforestation is that the limited research from the Mekong region and from Southeast Asia more generally often points in the wrong direction. So the sample size is incredibly small, and it's also worrying. In the other study that I didn't have time to present, Cambodia shows up as the one exception to the trend that community forestry is actually pretty good for forest cover. And for those of you who know anything about Cambodia and community forestry, you can understand why. It illustrates the point that I was making about formalization needs additional support in many ways. And there's an interesting story from Indonesia as well in the study that Marcus was reviewing, but we can talk about that later.
Thank you. There is a question for Kevin. Kevin, you still here with us? Excellent. Is there an existing pledge for direct financing in other landscapes and not just tropical forests? Please use only 1 minute.
The existing pledge covers only tropical forests. I expect that the next pledge to be announced at COP30 will expand beyond tropical forests, also to include other landscapes still in ODA eligible countries. I hope that that pledge will also include a target for direct funding. There have been calls for civil society that at least 30% of the next pledge should be earmarked for direct funding to Indigenous and local community organizations.
I am impressed. Thank you. Both of you are doing really well. The next question is, what ways the Indigenous people and NGOs can access funds from the donors to support Indigenous people's rights, and especially around the area of natural resource management in the Mekong region? I guess it goes to you too, Kevin.
I would use this as an opportunity to echo the point about the lack of evidence coming out of the region. If we look across funding across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, we see that funding for Asia is the lowest, even though 2/3 of the world's indigenous peoples live in Asia. I think there's a lot of complex reasons for that, but one important one is the lack of global visibility of the opportunities for investing in securing tenure in Asia and especially in the Mekong region, and of the potential impacts and benefits of that. So I think there's a part of that is a research problem, part of that is a communications and advocacy problem. but I think it's also an opportunity. We are seeing funding for Asia in particular is starting to increase. It more than doubled between 2023 and 2024, for example, but from a very low baseline and still a long way to go.
Excellent, thank you. Our last question for Mr. Currey again. What about private sector? What is the status of their involvement with communities and what the role that they play in their own interest somehow, with a big question mark?
I have no data on that, but what I can say is I think that's an important next frontier for this discussion. And from my experience, I'm just back from spending quite a bit of time in the Brazilian Amazon. And what I can see is communities there are really interested in thinking about alternative economic models, some of which could include new kinds of partnerships with the private sector. So I think that's a really important question.
Thank you very much. It's not fair to ask both of you to pack years of research and a trimester that you teach into 1 minute. But thank you, you did incredibly well. Please give both of them a big round of applause. Thank you. There are more questions coming in, but time is up. There will be space. We can also share this question later in our communications with all the participants. And you do have the contact details of these two speakers on swap cards. Now we move on to a really exciting one too, which is a group photo. What a forum without a group photo, right? But before we do that, I just want to make sure that you know we will have group photo and a coffee break or health break, whatever you would like to call it, and all together